This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas.
Welcome in, everybody. We're diving deep today into Canadian families. You know how everyone always talks about the typical Canadian family?
Right, yeah.
Well, get ready to rethink some assumptions because we're looking at how that picture has been changing big time over the past 3 decades. Our guide for this deep dive is the Families Count 2024 report, which tracks all sorts of family structures.
And let me tell you, some of the trends are pretty surprising, even for someone like me who studies this stuff.
Like marriage, for example.
Oh yeah, marriage?
It's declining significantly across Canada.
It is.
Less than half of adults over 15 were married in 2021.
Wow.
That's a huge drop from 54.1% back in 1991.
Huge, yeah.
So what's going on? Are people just deciding to stay single forever?
Well, not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. It seems Canadians are redefining what commitment looks like.
How so?
Well, for one thing, common law partnerships are way up,
Really?
especially in Quebec and Nunavut.
Interesting.
So people are still seeking connection, but maybe not always washing to the altar.
Right, so commitment, but on their own terms.
Exactly.
And it's not just relationships that are changing, right? The report also mentions Canadians hitting major life milestones later than previous generations.
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing people marry later, have kids later, move out later.
The whole timeline shifted.
It really has.
Like the average age of marriage in 2020 was 34.8. That's more than 3 years older than in 1994.
It's a big jump.
So what's behind this delay?
Well, there are a lot of factors. Higher education is one.
Makes sense. People are staying in school longer.
Yeah, and building their careers first.
Right, getting financially stable.
Exactly. And also there's this desire for personal growth before settling down.
Taking time to figure things out.
Plus, common law unions often come before marriage these days.
So that pushes the average age up even more.
That does.
It's interesting how all these things are interconnected.
Yeah, it really is a broader societal shift, not just about one thing.
Okay, but what about divorce then? If fewer people are getting married, does that mean divorce rates are going up?
Actually, no, that's the really surprising part.
Really?
Yeah, divorce rates have been dropping since the early 1990s.
How is that possible?
Well, part of it is the aging population.
Okay, older people are less likely to divorce.
Exactly. But there's another big factor, too.
What's that?
Remember all those common law partnerships we talked about?
Right, they're super common now.
Well, divorce stats only track legal marriages.
Ah, so those breakups aren't being counted the same way.
Exactly.
That really skews the data, doesn't it?
It does. It's a good reminder that the way we measure things affects what we see.
Speaking of common law relationships, it's kind of wild how common they've become.
It is nearly 1 in 4 couples in Canada now.
That's huge compared to just 6.3% back in 1981.
Huge change.
Yeah. And it seems like younger generations are really driving this trend.
They are. They're often prioritizing what works for them right now.
Rather than tradition.
Exactly. They might not see marriage as a necessity.
So it's about the relationship itself, not the legal status.
It seems that way.
Now there's this even newer thing, living apart together, or LAT couples.
Oh yeah, LAT couples.
Almost 1.5 million Canadians were in LAT relationships in 2017, according to the report.
It's a growing trend for sure.
It's fascinating these are committed couples who live in separate places.
I know, it's interesting, right?
So why do they choose this?
Well, some like their independence. Some never even considered living together in the first place.
Huh.
And sometimes there are practical reasons, like jobs in different cities.
Okay, so it's not always a deliberate choice.
Right, but even when it is, it shows how people are blending connection and autonomy in new ways.
It challenges the traditional idea of what a couple should be.
It does. It says a lot about how we view relationships now.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about polyamorous families.
Okay.
These are families where partners have consensual, ethical, non-monogamous relationships.
Right, so multiple emotional and/or sexual connections.
And this can get illegally tricky, right? Because Canadian law traditionally only recognizes relationships between 2 people.
It does. It creates all sorts of challenges for polyamorous families.
Especially when it comes to things like parental rights.
Exactly.
But there have been some court cases recently where judges have acknowledged these changing family dynamics.
There have. It's encouraging.
Like some judges have granted parental rights to more than 2 parents in polyamorous families.
Which is a big step.
It shows how the legal system is slowly catching up to how society is changing.
It is, but there's still a long way to go, for sure.
Okay, another trend we're seeing is more young adults living at home.
The so-called boomerang kids.
Exactly. In 2021, almost half of those aged 20 to 29 were living with at least one parent.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, and it's not just about laziness or anything.
No, not at all.
There are economic factors at play, like the cost of housing,
That's a big one, especially in places like Nunavut and Ontario.
Right, those housing markets are tough.
Plus, more people are going to college or university.
So they're living at home longer to save money.
It makes sense.
And societal norms are changing too.
Yeah, it's not as unusual now to see young adults living with their parents.
So it's a mix of things, really.
It is.
It challenges that old idea of moving out and being independent by a certain age.
It really does.
Speaking of living arrangements, multi-generational households are becoming more common too.
Oh yeah, 3 or more generations under one roof.
In 2021, there were 2.4 million Canadians in these arrangements.
That's quite a jaw.
It's especially common in Indigenous and immigrant families.
It reflects cultural values around family support and togetherness.
Of course, but economic factors can play a role too.
For sure, especially when housing costs are high.
Okay, last one for this section, step families.
Blended family.
Yeah, they're more common now because more couples are separating or divorcing.
In 2021, 8.4% of families with kids were step families.
And it's even more prevalent among same-gender couples, nearly 40%.
Blending families can be really rewarding, but also challenging.
Navigating new roles and relationships, different parenting styles.
It takes patience and a lot of communication.
And it can take years for everyone to adjust and feel like a unit.
It's a process, for sure.
Before we wrap up this first part, let's talk about declining fertility rates.
Okay.
Canada's fertility rate hit a record low in 2022.
Only 1.33 children per woman.
It's a pretty steep decline.
It is.
What's driving this?
Well, women are more involved in higher education and the workforce now.
Right, they have more options beyond motherhood.
Exactly. And there's also greater access to contraception.
And less religious influence, maybe.
Potentially.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these societal shifts impact family size.
It really is. And it's not the same everywhere in Canada either.
Right, like Nunavut has the highest fertility rate.
And BC and Nova Scotia have the lowest.
So regional differences are important too.
They are. It highlights how complex this issue is.
And how there's no single explanation for these trends.
Absolutely. It's a mix of factors.
Okay, well, we'll take a break here for now and come back to explore even more fascinating aspects of Canadian families in part 2.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you to everyone who has left such positive reviews on our podcast episodes. It helps to make the podcast visible to so many more people. We read them all. Back to Heliox, where evidence meets empathy.
Welcome back, folks. We're picking up our deep dive into Canadian family structures, and this time we're going to look at some less traditional family journeys, starting with adoption.
Adoption, yeah, it's a topic that always seems to spark strong feelings, and it really makes you think about what family truly means and the needs of children.
For sure.
You know, I think a lot of people would be shocked to learn that only around 2,000 kids in Canada are adopted each year.
Really?
Yeah, that's just a tiny sliver of the over 30,000 kids who are currently waiting for permanent families.
Wow, that's a big gap.
It is. It really highlights how much more awareness we need about adoption as a way to build a family.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what's preventing more adoptions from happening. Is it that people just don't know enough about it? Or are there a lot of bureaucratic hoops to jump through? Or maybe it's societal perceptions about adoption?
It's probably a mix of all those things. And we have to remember that adoption isn't a one-size-fits-all thing.
Right.
The Family Count Report actually outlines 3 main ways adoption happens in Canada, each with its own unique aspects to consider.
Okay, so what are the 3 ways?
The most common way is through the public child welfare system.
Okay, so through the government.
Right, it's publicly funded and operates in every province and territory.
And what's the focus there?
Finding forever homes for kids who are in government care.
Okay, so kids who've often been through the foster care system?
Exactly.
Got it.
Then there are private adoption agencies.
Okay, so those connect birth parents with prospective adoptive families.
Right, but this option is currently only available in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario.
And is it publicly funded like the child welfare system?
Nope, so there can be pretty hefty costs involved for families.
So that financial barrier probably plays a big role in who can even consider that route.
Definitely. And finally, there's the option of direct arrangements between parents.
Okay, so the birth parents choose the adoptive family themselves.
Exactly, but this is only allowed in New Brunswick right now.
Interesting. So there's a lot of variation across the country.
It is, and it raises a lot of ethical questions to think about.
For sure, both for the children and the families involved.
And we can't forget about adoption within Indigenous communities.
Right, those are often called custom adoptions.
And they work a bit differently, right?
They do. The arrangements are usually made directly between the birth parents and adoptive parents without going through an agency.
And the birth parents often stay involved in the child's life.
Which is different from other forms of adoption.
It really shows how important it is to understand the cultural context of adoption.
Absolutely. Policies and practices need to respect the traditions and values of Indigenous communities.
And speaking of policies, the report really emphasizes the need for better national data on adoption across Canada.
Yeah, it's hard to get a clear picture when things vary so much from province to province.
Like Quebec is the only province that keeps track of all adoptions, both domestic and international.
Huh, interesting.
And they actually have specific benefits for adoptive parents in their parental insurance plan.
Oh, wow. Other provinces could definitely learn from that.
For sure, it's about recognizing the unique needs of adoptive families.
Right, especially since many adopted kids have been through trauma or instability before finding their forever home.
So those families need extra support to navigate those complexities.
Absolutely.
You mentioned foster care earlier.
I did.
Let's talk more about that system.
Okay, sounds good.
It's designed to give temporary care and support to children who can't live with their families for whatever reason.
Like if there's neglect or abuse going on?
Or if the parents are struggling with addiction or legal issues.
So foster families provide a safe place until the kids can either go back home or find a permanent placement.
Right, and that sometimes includes adoption.
Got it.
In 2021, there were more than 26,000 foster kids under 15 in Canada.
That's a lot of kids.
It is. It's about 1 in every 250 kids in that age group.
Wow. It really shows how important foster families are.
They really are. They open their homes and hearts to kids going through tough times.
And knowing it's often temporary, that must be hard.
It is. It's emotionally and practically demanding work.
And it's not evenly distributed, right? There are big disparities when it comes to which kids end up in foster care.
Sadly, yeah. Indigenous children are way overrepresented in the foster care system.
How so?
Well, in 2021, Indigenous kids made up over half of all foster children.
That's huge.
It is, especially when you consider that they represent less than 8% of the total child population in Canada.
Wow, that's a shocking disparity.
It reflects a lot of deep-rooted problems like systemic discrimination and ongoing trauma in Indigenous communities.
The report mentions things like the 60s scoop.
Right, that's where Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in non-Indigenous homes.
And sadly, similar practices continue today. It's been called the Millennium Scoop.
It's heartbreaking. It's a situation that needs urgent attention and action.
Absolutely.
But there have been some positive steps taken recently.
Like what?
Like the 2019 Act respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth, and families.
Okay, so that's a step towards recognizing Indigenous communities' rights to handle their own child and family services.
Exactly. It's about self-determination and making sure Indigenous kids can grow up connected to their culture and communities.
It's a good start, but there's still a long way to go.
For sure. Okay, let's shift gears a bit again.
Okay.
Let's talk about another life transition that's become less common over time, but still has a huge impact on families.
What's that?
Widowhood.
Ah, yes.
Remember how we talked about Canadians living longer?
Yeah, people are living longer than ever these days.
Well, that longer lifespan plays a role here, too.
How so?
Well, in 1991, over 33% of Canadians aged 65 and older were widowed.
Okay.
But by 2021, that number had dropped to 20%.
So fewer widowed seniors.
Exactly. It's because people are living longer, healthcare has improved, and people are marrying later in life.
So all those things combined lead to fewer widows and widowers.
Exactly. But even though widowhood is less common now, it's still a really profound experience for those who go through it.
Absolutely. It's not just about the emotional toll of losing a partner. It can also have financial and social impacts.
Especially for older adults who might suddenly have to deal with new expenses or the loss of income.
It's a lot to handle.
The report mentions programs like the Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security, which can help financially.
Okay, so there's some financial support available.
There is, but the impact of losing a partner goes way beyond money.
Of course.
It's about the loss of companionship, shared memories, and that deep emotional support.
That's irreplaceable.
It is, and we need to make sure widowed individuals and families have access to social and emotional support too.
Right, not just financial help.
And we need to remember that everyone grieves differently.
For sure, there's no right or wrong way to cope with loss.
It's about providing resources and understanding to help people go through this in their own way and in their own time.
Absolutely, everyone's journey is unique. A shout out to our many listeners in Gibsons, Sechelt, Melbourne, Helsinki, New Orleans, Vancouver, Singapore, Copenhagen, and Sydney. We see you. Thank you for subscribing, following, commenting, and supporting our podcast. Find related articles at Heliox Podcasts on Substack. Back to Heliox, where evidence meets empathy.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Canadian families.
We've covered a lot of ground already, haven't we? Marriage, common law, multi-generational households.
Adoption, foster care, the challenges facing Indigenous families, widowhood.
But there's still more to uncover.
There is. Each family structure tells its own story.
It's like a tapestry, all these threads woven together.
Exactly. And this time we'll look at some structures that don't always get as much attention.
Okay, sounds good.
Like blended families, for example.
Yeah, those are becoming more and more common as divorce rates stay high.
We touched on them briefly before, but I think it's worth really digging into the dynamics of these families.
Definitely. It can be pretty complex.
Think about it. You've got two sets of parents, maybe step-siblings you've never met before.
Also trying to blend their lives together.
Exactly, and each parent might have different rules and expectations.
Yeah, that could lead to some friction.
It often does, especially for the kids.
It can be a lot to handle, being thrown into this new family dynamic.
Research suggests it can take years for blended families to truly feel like a unit.
Years, wow.
It takes time and effort from everyone.
So what helps make that transition smoother?
Communication is key, being open and honest with each other.
Right, and patience, lots of patience.
And a willingness to compromise, realizing everyone's coming from different places.
And the adults have their own challenges too, right?
Absolutely, blending parenting styles can be tough.
Especially when you're trying to figure out discipline and boundaries.
It can create tension, even the best of circumstances.
So how do couples navigate that?
Again, communication is key, being respectful of each other's approaches.
And putting the needs of the kids first.
That's always the priority. Okay, now let's talk about skip-generation families.
Skip generation.
Yeah, where grandparents are raising their grandkids.
Oh, right. Taking on the parenting role themselves.
Exactly. It's a trend that's often born out of difficult situations.
Like if the parents are struggling with addiction or mental health issues.
Or if they're incarcerated or have passed away.
So the grandparents step in to provide stability and love.
They do, but it can be incredibly challenging for them.
In what ways?
Well, many are retired, so they might have their own health concerns or be on a fixed income.
Right. And raising kids is expensive.
It is, and they might also be dealing with legal issues.
Like custody arrangements and things like that.
Exactly, and the emotional burden can be huge, too.
Of course, they're also grieving the loss of their own child while raising their grandkids.
It's a lot to carry. The report really emphasizes the need for more support for these families.
They need all the help they can get.
They do financial assistance, legal guidance, respite care, emotional support.
All of that is crucial.
It's about recognizing the vital role these grandparents play in their grandkids' lives.
And making sure they have the resources to succeed.
Absolutely. Okay, last but certainly not least, let's talk about chosen families.
Chosen families, what are those exactly?
These are families formed through bonds of friendship, shared values, a sense of belonging.
Okay, so not necessarily blood relative.
Right, it's about creating a support system that feels like family.
I like that.
It's especially important for people who might not have strong ties to their biological families.
Like LGBTQ plus individuals who've experienced rejection or estrangement.
Exactly. Chosen families offer that unconditional love and acceptance.
A safe space where they can be themselves.
It's a beautiful thing. It shows how we can create those deep connections outside of traditional definitions of family.
It really expands our idea of what family can be.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Canadian families, what are your biggest takeaways?
I'm struck by the sheer diversity of it all.
Me too. It's amazing how families are changing and adapting.
Challenging norms, redefining kinship.
From the decline of marriage to the rise of blended families and skip-generation households.
From the complexities of adoption to the growing recognition of chosen families.
It's clear there's no one right way to be a family.
And that's a good thing, right? It shows how resilient and creative human relationships can be.
It does, but it also highlights the need for policies and support systems that reflect this diversity.
We need to make sure all families have what they need to thrive, regardless of their structure.
Absolutely. Everyone deserves support and respect. So as we say goodbye, I encourage you to think about what family means to you.
It's a question worth pondering.
How has your own family shaped who you are? And how do we as a society create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for all families? Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of Canadian families.
It's been fascinating.
We hope it's given you a new perspective on the ever-evolving landscape of family life in Canada and beyond. Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.